yet again, when we debate the defence of the realm, the first duty of government, the reform bench is empty. Yet again, the plastic patriots have gone AWOL when we discuss the defence of this country. Count Binface clearly has them worried in Clacton. Now, as I am a historian by training, perhaps I could offer some historical context. Arguments about military readiness are not new. The Roman military theorist Vegetus, some 2 millennia ago, coined the now famous phrase, civis pacem para bellum. He who desires peace should prepare for war in order to deter it. There have been times in British history when we've disregarded Vegetus's sage advice. For instance, following the First World War, when Britain fought at great cost, both human and financial, in 1919, a Liberal-led government introduced the concept of a 10-year rule, a pan-Whitehall edict that no major war was likely for at least a decade. This continued on a rolling basis into the 1930s. On the 9th of February 1933, just 10 days after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, in the now famous Oxford Union debate, referred to several times already, the students resolved by more than 2 to 1 that this House would under no circumstances fight for king and country. And yet a few years later, many of them, we know, did. The 10-year rule was only finally rescinded in the mid-1930s. Nevertheless, as General Lord Dannatt pointed out in his excellent recent book, Victory into Defeat, our armed forces still didn't recover sufficiently in time to deter Hitler from launching what eventually became World War II, in which some 60 million people perished worldwide.
My right honourable friend allow me?
Yes.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and for once, having spoken on this very subject the week before last, I thought I would sit and listen to what others have to say. And does he agree with me that one of the reasons for the failure of deterrence in the beginning of the Second World War and at the beginning of the First World War was that the United States was detached from the future of security in Europe, and the success of NATO has hinged on the knowledge that an attack on any NATO country would mean war with the United States from the outset. So does he share my concern that the United States at present is led by someone with insufficient regard for that history?
NATO is the most successful defensive alliance in history, and Article 5 is its absolute fulcrum. We must maintain our commitment to Article 5 to keep all NATO nations safe. At Fulton, Missouri in 1946, Churchill said that an Iron Curtain had descended, and that led us into the Cold War. In the mid-1980s, under Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, defence spending was gusting about 5% of gross domestic product. When the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, countries across the West took a peace dividend. Francis Fukuyama wrote his famous book, The End of History, in 1992, and many in the West believed that the threat of world war had finally receded. When the Conservatives left office in 1997, we were still spending around 3% of GDP on defence. That downward trend, though, continued under Tony Blair's government, although, in fairness, he was only doing what many other Western democracies were doing too. However, if we come forward to today, we now face a revanchist Russia, led by Putin, who launched an invasion of Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, and then an even more brutal full-scale invasion in 2022. As someone who visited Ukraine in February of this year, I'd remind the House the Ukrainians would argue they've therefore been at war with Russia not for 4 years, but for 12, even longer than the First and Second World Wars combined. Against this rising threat, Labour produced its much-vaunted Strategic Defence Review, and there was much good in it, but it still contained echoes of the 10-year rule, declaring the government's intention on page 43 to deter, fight and win with allies against states with advanced military forces by 2035. That's 9 years away. The Chief of the General Staff has warned we might have to fight Russia in 2027. The First Sea Lord said 2029. And even the outgoing Prime Minister said it might be 2030. So how are we supposed to deter Putin with not a single attack submarine currently at sea, still with no new AWACS aircraft in service in the Royal Air Force, and Ajax almost a decade late and still not in operational service, despite ministers previously promising us it was fine? That really is corrosive complacency, isn't it? The threat is now, and we need to rearm accordingly, including spending 3% on GDP by 2029 at the very latest, if not earlier. The three co-authors of the SDR were adamant that the cost of implementing it was 3% of GDP on defence. And a year after SDR was published, we finally received Labour's plan of how to pay for it, the so-called Defence Investment Plan. But this was not before Labour's Defence Secretary and their Armed Forces Minister, who's in his place, had both resigned on the 11th of June after months of frustration with the Treasury over the paucity of funding in the plan. As the outgoing Defence Secretary powerfully wrote in his resignation letter to the Prime Minister, "You've been unable, and the Treasury has been unwilling to commit the resources the nation needs to defend the country at this time of rising threats." That is damning. His Armed Forces Minister said in his own letter, "I've sat in the rooms, seen the assessments and spoken to the commanders who will be asked to do more with less, and I cannot in good conscience stand at the dispatch box and defend the level of investment I know to be inadequate to the task." Moreover, the outgoing Defence Secretary revealed what he'd been offered was an increase in defence spending to only 2.68% of GDP by 2030, billions short of what the SDR authors required. The new Defence Secretary has tried to argue he's been given some additional funding, a bit over £1 billion, but this only takes defence spending to barely 2.69% of GDP by 2030, a difference that doesn't really even touch the sides. In fact, it's sadly worse than that. The Chiefs of Staff have been urging the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to invest an additional £28 billion in defence over the next 4 years, in part to enable them to implement Labour's SDR. They were offered barely £15 billion instead. However, on closer examination, even this sum unravels very rapidly. To begin with, as we've already heard, £10.7 billion of that money is reliant on so-called efficiency savings, which is Whitehall code for cuts in MOD spending over the next 4 years, the bulk of which haven't even been identified yet. The chairman of the PAC on the day of publication described this as an old accountant's trick. And it still doesn't disguise that the MOD itself would have to make massive in-year spending cuts, including from operations and training, in order to recycle that money to fund their own defence investment plan. In fact, the Chief of the Defence Staff has warned of the implications of doing that only the other day. The disaster STIP also relies on a further £4.7 billion, which has not yet even been cleared by the Treasury, and it will be subject to another public spending round. In other words, the two sums combined will be more than the £15 billion of extra money that was promised. So there's practically actually no new money for defence at all. All we've been offered is Enron accounting and smoke and mirrors to try and pretend that a massive increase in defence spending is barely 0.01% of GDP over 4 years. No, I'm summing up. Lord Robertson, the lead author for the SDR, told the Defence Select Committee only yesterday, "We are running out of years. And the challenge is now bigger and more serious and earlier than we anticipated. And yet the Defence Investment Plan does not come up to it." General Barrons, his co-author, told the same committee, "The Prime Minister says Russia could attack NATO by 2030. We've essentially lost a year of mobilising for that." And even the DIP says on page 78, incredibly, I quote it, "The figures presented are indicative rather than precise cost estimates. They do not constitute binding commitments and are subject to the government's approval processes, affordability considerations and contracting procedures. Figures have been rounded and therefore may not sum. Well, you can say that again. In other words, this document isn't worth the paper it's printed on. And it relies on extra money that doesn't actually exist. We're not going to deter the likes of Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping with unfunded proposals like this. If Trotsky was right and war is now interested in us, we must rearm now to deter it. So I conclude by reluctantly finding that Labour are failing the people of this country in the first duty of government, the defence of the realm. And if the incoming Prime Minister can't plug that £5 billion black hole which he's just about to inherit, then he should make way for some people who can.